The evolution of information. Part 1. Consisting of a general introduction, a disclaimer and a topical introduction regarding the epistemological challenges surrounding the theory of evolution. General introduction. By the way, the voiceover was made with the help of www.acapella-box.com. Every year, a number of publications are dedicated to the reflection, re-evaluation, and increasingly often, it seems, even rejection of one of the most fascinating epistemological challenges of our time: the theory of evolution. I think it is reasonable to argue that a fair deal of these publications add very little towards resolving the epistemological problems surrounding the theory of evolution. In all probability, most of you know by now the various reasons certain interest groups employ to argue the impossibility of abiogenesis. What I want to do, in my own time, is to present an argument why the emergence of life, if the circumstances allow for it, might just be as inevitable as the increase of entropy over time. Although physics, chemistry, biology, linguistics and philosophy play a considerable role in this argument, I intend to demonstrate that information and numbers play an even more important role in all evolutionary processes prior to as well as after the emergence of life. Hence the name I chose for this channel, the evolution of information. Non-creationists are justifiably weary, and voice their concerns, when the term evolution is used outside its biological frame of reference. What I intend to do is to reinforce the basic proposition, inherent in its logical foundations, as proposed by Charles Darwin about 155 years ago, by putting it into a greater context. However, the argument, which I intend to present, did not emanate from pondering over the origin of life question from a biologist's point of view. Instead, it originated in a problem which is only remotely connected to the question regarding the origin of life: an analysis of the mathematical properties of the human language, which is also a long way away from where I started my academic career several years ago, biology and social sciences. At some point during my studies, I was dismayed to realize how little constructive impact the theory of evolution had on social sciences, especially sociology and political sciences, as well as linguistics and philosophy. At the same time, the little actual progress with respect to the origin of life question struck me as peculiar. It took me quite some time to understand that these problems are interrelated, and even more time to realize that until I found a way to quantify/algebraize the logic of reasoning, at least on some level, any reasoning on my part would be just that. If, however, I could point to a basic mathematical property of language, and there was some way to reason with numbers, then maybe that logic could assist in the formulation of an argument. The question, whether language is quantifiable, is one of those questions philosophers, logicians and linguists have brooded over for some time now, albeit that its basic mathematical properties are already well established. Nevertheless, understanding the mathematics of semantic meaning from the biased perspective of our modern and complex language system remains to this day one of the fundamental problems in the course of understanding the complexity of human language, its emergence and evolution, as well as the nature and the evolution of intelligence and cognitive processes, and has thus become a fundamental requirement towards the advancement of artificial intelligence. Aside from linguists, logicians, and cyberneticists, understanding the mathematics of language and reason also has serious consequences for certain discourses within philosophy, reaching as far back as, and probably beyond, the origins of Western philosophy. On that account, I have to admit that I am neither philosopher nor linguist. I guess some may count that against me. On reflection, however, I can think of at least one point in favor of my point of view. Neither am I philosopher nor linguist. Disclaimer. I am ignorant of more things than I am comfortable with. Ignorance is one of the fundamental flaws nature imposes on each generation anew. It is also one of the greatest gifts of evolution. It encompasses the potential for change. Overcoming one's own ignorance can be an arduous and tedious task. It requires the acceptance and the volition to overcome one's intellectual deficiencies. It is a socially accepted and, in most societies, even an admired goal an individual can set for him/herself. It also seldom conflicts with the status quo. Then, however, there is the ignorance we are generally unaware of, as we are living it, that is, the ignorance that is part of the social construct of reality, the ignorance which is inherent in the way we think and communicate about ourselves and our surroundings, the ignorance that is inherent in the process of communication itself, and thus part of the way we construct and perpetuate knowledge across generations. The epistemological deficiencies inherent in the intersubjective construction and communication of meaning are the reasons for the development and persistence of origin questions in the first place. What is life and when, where, how did it begin? What is consciousness and how does it work? What is language and how did it evolve? What is society and what is its fundamental nature? They are also the reasons why these questions are generally thought of as extremely difficult to solve. Some might even argue they are impossible to solve. Solving any of these questions does not only require to reflect upon and overcome one's own intellectual deficits, it requires to reflect upon and overcome the deficits of one's intellectual antecedents as well as the intellectual confinements of one's current social and cognitive reality. Topical introduction. Which brings me in a roundabout way to this channel's singular topic, the proposition inherent in the formula top everything else. Depending on your perspective, a variety of questions may arise. These will in all probability include questions concerning the concepts evolution and information. Both concepts are as yet insufficiently conceptualized across the various disciplines in which they are used. What is information? What is evolution? Why is it so difficult to conceptualize similarities between chemical, biological, and linguistic as well as cultural evolution within a naturalistic worldview? Are there corollaries between these concepts, beyond the shared terminology? Does scientific and general terminology, that is, the logic of knowledge, follow a quantifiable rule, from which insights into the workings of the mind can be deduced? To be sure, these questions, too, are by no means new. Neither is this list complete. If I were to list all the questions I had to consider along the way, that list would be quite complex. It would also be misleading. At this point, any such list would entail the proposition that the argument I intend to present can resolve all these questions. Some of them are at the core of philosophical debates throughout the ages as well as comparatively recent debates concerning the philosophy of science, and ongoing discourses in various scientific fields. For example, the most common understanding of evolution refers to Darwinian evolution, which in turn refers to life as fundamental constituent and DNA as basis for evolution to occur. The biological perspective on information refers to DNA above anything else, thus giving rise to the well-known origin question, how did DNA, a system of apparently meaningful encoded information, emerge out of the chaos of a diluted soup of elements? So far, theoreticians on both sides of the Great Divide have failed to answer this question, along with many other questions, regarding the nature of genetic information per se, what life essentially is, and so on. What then, you might justifiably ask, has an epistemological approach to offer, aside from its very own Munchausen trilemma? An epistemological approach is an attack on both sides of an argumentative stalemate. It tries to separate the process of perception from the process of conceptualization, or empiricism from cognitive bias. If a theoretical, and thus inherently cognitive problem remains unresolved, it's not understood as an unsurmountable difficulty the universe imposes upon us, but probably because those who are trying their hardest to solve these problems are subconsciously biased against the solution by the very thinking patterns prevalent within their respective intellectual community. I do not intend to invoke, nor do I propose any causality beyond that which is already known. Instead, I intend to deconstruct knowledge at its core to demonstrate its epistemological bias on a mathematical basis and propose a solution to some epistemological problems in accordance to generally accepted principles of logic and nature. In doing so, I will not only have to deconstruct the fragmented empirical reality we have come to accept, but I will also have to provide an understanding why science progresses the way it does. I do also intend to present a different perspective on some of the fundamental problems of science and philosophy, that is not only slightly off, but literally lateral to traditional lines of thinking. To this end, I think that I can reasonably argue the proposition expressed in this channel's title, which connects chemical evolution, biological evolution and the evolution of language and abstract thought within a non-deterministic and probabilistic continuum of evolutionary development based on quantifiable information. The logic behind this argument, however, is neither as simple or straightforward as the last sentence might indicate. To pull this off, I'll have to demonstrate that language is quantifiable and how this quantifiability accounts for the evolution of semantic meaning and the logical shape of abstract thought. Apart from the fact that this one idea alone takes a century-old tradition of thought head-on by itself, this will still be the most universally accessible and thus the easiest part of the argument. Further, I will have to place this evolutionary process within the realm of biological and biochemical processes, without contradicting established biological and logical evidences. Further still, I will have to demonstrate what kind of information precedes DNA and how pregenetic and genetic information relate to the system of which they are part of and constituents as well. Basically, I will have to formulate a solution for the logical problem, known as the chicken and the egg problem. As this line of reasoning affects the very foundations of our understanding of the nature and the origin of genetic information and life itself, nothing in the ensuing argument should be contradicted by currently established empirical facts regarding the nature of genetic information and the nature of biological evolution. I probably won't have to point out that none of this has been done successfully before, and usually I am not in the habit of quoting authorities to make a point stick. Quoting Edward Teller at this point, however, does not really assign any outside credibility to the argument. Two paradoxes are better than one. They may even suggest a solution. As this whole line of reasoning started with an admittedly quite naive perspective on language and knowledge, the origin of that reasoning as well as its progress are not as straightforward as scientists usually are acquainted to or even aspire to. Instead of a thesis that is to be argued, I began by asking myself a series of loosely connected questions. Instead of proof or evidence, I sought an understanding if and how these questions, and the problems expressed therein, are related. The original argument in its totality is probably best compared to play with increasingly complex ideas, and numbers. Especially numbers. It is numbers and the mathematics of reason that are essential to the argument. Thus, The argument progresses from a nightly intuition along the line of, hey, there is a way to link language constructively to numbers, to, why isn't this known already, to, what is knowledge, anyway? And also from, it's one of those problems which are at the core of philosophical debates throughout the ages and could just provide a logical testimony for the theory of evolution, to, there's the crux of the matter. The argument expands on the epistemological difference between thinking in evolutionary terms and evolutionary thinking. One allows you to pragmatically consolidate empirical discontinuities in astronomical, biological and linguistic evolution within a somewhat uncertain narrative. The other does not only assume, but develops and ultimately proposes a narrative that establishes quantifiable information as a core concept in any of those instances and, on top of that, links them all together via an increasingly abstract conceptualization of probabilistic evolution. The former approach unconsciously aims to reaffirm the current system of knowledge. The second approach seeks to deconstruct the way we think about the world. And although science should have no comfort zone, individual scientists do, just as anyone else, for that matter. Very few empirical scientists are swayed by epistemological reasons, and few philosophers and linguists are open to biological or even mathematical arguments. Which is also the main reason for this argument being proposed via YouTube. Here, I don't have to convince any one group in particular. Whether it is the process of the formation of life from elementary systems, or the organizational principle by which seemingly disordered interactions evolve into a complex system of language. To claim insight into just one origin question is generally indicative of madness, or worse. To argue the existence of an evolutionary continuum that consolidates several unresolved problems of equal epistemological complexity and has to be understood in its entirety to be understood in its parts, either transcends the fragmented reality of modern, empirical sciences or is just batshit crazy in itself. Either way, addressing even one of these problems in today's academic climate, and in such a definite way, will be tantamount to a career ender. Either you succeed, in which case there is little more that you can accomplish in life, or you fail, in which case you will probably lose all your credibility within your peer. And besides earnings, not losing, and if possible, increasing, one's own, or at least one's employer's, credibility has become one of the major concerns in our modern world. Whether or not this argument adds to the complexity of knowledge remains to be seen. At the very least, it might spark an interest in unconventional approaches to solve some of the contemporary problems in science and philosophy. At this point, I'd like to thank you for your time and your patience, and hope to have at least engaged your curiosity, despite the lack of visual theatralics. To conclude this episode, and in accordance with previous remarks on that issue, I'd like to quote two philosophical statements. The first quote has its roots in an ancient, yet thriving Eastern philosophy. The second quote is one of only a few surviving tenets of a somewhat obscure, pre-Socratic school of Western philosophical thought. The first one reads, "All is one and all is different." The second one, "All is number."